So he did the worst thing possible, according to the Chicago School, which is impose wage and price controls. And the irony is that two key Chicago School figures, Donald Rumsfeld, who had studied with Friedman as a sort of, I guess he kind of audited his courses. He wasn't enrolled as a student, but he describes this time as studying at the feet of geniuses, and he describes himself as a young pup at the University of Chicago. And George Shultz were the two people who imposed wage and price controls under Nixon, and when Nixon declared we're all Keynesians now. So for Friedman, this was a terrible betrayal, and it also made him think that maybe you couldn't impose these policies in a democracy. And Nixon famously said we're all Keynesians now. But the catch was he wouldn't impose these policies at home because it would have cost him the next election, and Nixon was reelected with a 60% margin after he imposed wage and price controls. But he unleashed the school on Latin America and turned Chile under Augusto Pinochet into a laboratory for these radical ideas, which were not compatible with democracy in the United States, but were infinitely possible under a dictatorship in Latin America.
Explain what happened in Chile.
Well, I think, Democracy Now! Viewers and listeners know this chapter in history, which was that after Salvador Allende was elected, a democratic socialist was elected in 1970, there was a plot to overthrow him. And Nixon famously said, make the economy scream. And the plot had many elements, an embargo and so on. And finally, the support for Pinochet's coup on September 11th, 1973. And we often hear about the Chicago boys in Chile, but we don't hear that many details about who they actually were. And so what I do in the book is I retell this chapter of history, but for me, the economic agenda of the Pinochet government is much more front and center, because I think we do know the human rights abuses. We know about Chile we know about Pinochet rounding up people, taking them to stadiums, the summary executions, the torture. We know a little bit less about the economic program that he pushed in the window of opportunity that opened up after the shock of that coup. And this is where it fits into the shock doctrine thesis. I think if you look at Chile, and this is why I spend some time in the book looking at it, examining it, we see Iraq. We see Iraq today. We see so many similarities between the intersection of a manufactured crisis and the imposition of radical economic shock therapy right afterwards. And I'm thinking about the sort of parallels between Paul Bremer's period in Iraq, when he went into Baghdad with the city still burning, and just, I came on the show at the time talking about how he had torn up the whole economic architecture of the country and turned it into this laboratory for the most radical free market policies possible. Well, in Chile, on September 11th, 1973, while the tanks were rolling in the streets of Santiago, while the presidential palace was burning and Salvador Allende lay dead, there was a group of so-called Chicago boys who were Chilean economists who had been brought to the University of Chicago to study on full scholarship by the U.S. government as part of a deliberate strategy to try to move Latin America to the right, after it had moved so far to the left. So this was a very ideological government-funded program, part of what Chile's former foreign minister calls a project of deliberate ideological transfer, i.e. bringing these students to this very extreme school at the University of Chicago and indoctrinating them in a brand of economics that was marginal in the United States at the time, and then sending them home as ideological warriors. So this group of economists who had failed to sway Chileans to their point of view when it was just part of an open debate, stayed up all night that night on September 11th, 1973, and they were photocopying a document called The Brick. It's known as the BRIC. And what it was the economic program for Pinochet's government. And it has these striking similarities, Amy, with George Bush's 2000 election platform. It talks about an ownership society, privatizing Social Security, charter schools, a flat tax. This is all straight out of Milton Friedman's playbook. This document was on the desk of the generals on September the 12th when they reported for work the day after the coup, and it was the program for Pinochet's government. So what I'm doing in the book is saying, these two things are not coincidental. When Pinochet died, he died the same shortly before Milton Friedman. We heard, or actually he died shortly after Milton Friedman. we heard this narrative, in places like the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal of course, we disapprove of his human rights violations and the sort of shaking of fingers at the atrocities that we know about in Chile. But he was on the economy. He was terrific, as if there was no connection between the free market revolution that he was able to push through and the extraordinary human rights violations that took place at the same time. And what I'm doing in the book, and what many Latin Americans do in their work, is obviously connect the two and say it would have been impossible to push through this economic program without the extraordinary repression and the demolition of democracy.
Let's talk about shock in the sense of torture. It's where you begin. Blank is beautiful. Talk about that.
Well, I start the book looking at at the two laboratories for the shock doctrine. As I said, I look at different forms of shock. One is the economic shock, and another is body shocks to people. And they aren't always there, but they have been there at key junctures. This is the shock of torture. So one of the laboratories for this doctrine was the University of Chicago in the 1950s, when all of these Latin American economists were trained to become economic shock therapists. Another one, this isn't some sort of grand conspiracy that it was all planned, but there was another school which served as a different kind of shock laboratory, which was McGill University in the 1950s. McGill University was ground zero for the experiments that the CIA funded in order to understand how to basically how to torture. I mean, it was called mind control at the time, or brainwashing at the time, but now we understand, thanks to the work of people like Alfred McCoy, who has been a guest on your program, that actually what was being researched in the 1950s under the MK Ultra program, when there were these experiments in extreme electroshock, LSD, PCP, extreme sensory deprivation, sensory overload, that actually what was being developed was the manual that we can now see at use in Guantanamo and Abu Ghraib. This is a manual for unmaking personalities, for total regression of personalities, and creating that window of opportunity where people are very suggestible, as we saw in the film. So McGill, in part because I think it was seen by the CIA as easier to perform these experiments outside the U.S.
McGill in Montreal.
McGill in Montreal, at the time, the head of psychiatry was a man named Ewan Cameron. He was actually an American citizen. He was formerly head of the American Psychiatric Association, which I think is quite relevant to the debates going on right now about complicity in the psychiatric profession with current interrogation techniques. Ewan Cameron was head of the American Psychiatric Association. He moved to McGill to be head of psychiatry and to head up a hospital called the Allen Memorial Hospital, which was a psychiatric hospital. He got funding from the CIA, and he turned the Allen Memorial Hospital into this extraordinary laboratory for what we now understand as alternative interrogation techniques. He dosed his patients with these odd cocktails of drugs like LSD and PCP. He put them to sleep, sort of into a comatose state for up to a month. He put some of his patients into extreme sensory deprivation, and the point was to make them lose track of time and space. And what Ewan Cameron believed, or at least what he said he believed, was that all mental illness was taught later in life. These were patterns that set in later in life. He was a behavioral psychologist. And so rather than getting at the root of those problems and trying to understand them, he believed that the way to treat mental illness was to take adult patients and reduce them to a childlike state. And it's been well known, it was well known at the time, that one of the side effects of electroshock therapy was memory loss. And this was something that was seen actually by most doctors as a problem, because patients were treated, they may have reported some positive results, but they forgot all kinds of things about their life. Ewan Cameron looked at this research and thought, aha, this is good, because he believed that it was the patterns that were set in later in life, that if he could take his patients back to an infantile state before they even had language, before they knew who they were, then he could essentially remother them, and he could turn them into healthy people.